Hello, I'm Tommy Moore from the Bartitzer Lab, and in this video I wanted to talk to you about the auxiliary units or stay-behinds. Now, I spend a lot of my time talking about researching, experimenting with the work of organisations like the SOE, the Commandos, the OSS, especially when it comes to things like gutter fighting, unarmed, sticks, blades, instinctive combat shooting. All of these things are really cool, relatively well documented. There are footage, there's guides, there's books, there's all sorts of stuff we can do to explore and play with it. Something that might not be known on a more global level, especially outside of Britain, is the work of the auxiliaries. Now, the auxiliaries were quite unique in that they were designed from the start to be a disruptive resistance style unit, in that before the event of an invasion, these guys were ready and trained and able and informed enough to cause absolute carnage and havoc behind enemy lines. Now, if you imagine in the early phases of the war, and Britain's not doing too well at all, and it only takes Germany to have control of the skies and therefore get control of the channel, and suddenly if they've got a beachhead, it wouldn't be very hard at all for the Wehrmacht, which is a very, very capable military, to move their way through Britain, especially if you think of the huge loss of expertise, manpower, equipment that happened after Dunkirk. So you can imagine that Britain would start to be rolled up pretty easily. You know, there would be resistance naturally, but it would happen apace. Britain is not a particularly large country. It's not particularly hard terrain to fight on. You know, it's not like a heavily mountainous region. It doesn't have particularly arduous weather. So you can imagine that it wouldn't take very long at all. So what the auxiliaries were designed to do was essentially wait for the Germans to go past and then do your typical clandestine irregular warfare jobs of assassinating people, of blowing up bridges, railroads, fuel dumps, ammunition dumps, causing general havoc, terror, chaos, causing manpower to be deployed to other areas, essentially being a drain on the psychological, the emotional, the financial, the logistical resources of the Germans, buying time during that rolling up of Britain for Britain to get its shit together and organise proper defence, start to bring in troops from the Empire, start to bolster its defences, and essentially, as we say in Great Britain, find its elbow from its arsehole. So that's the job of the auxiliaries. And the auxiliaries are essentially crack commando home guard. Yeah. So if you imagine, there are lots of reserved occupations in World War II. If you're a coal miner, if you're a farmer, you know, there are occupations where you might otherwise be young, fit, healthy, intelligent, talented, but sod's law, you also have to be born in rural Dorset and you're a really good fisherman, farmer, tin miner, whatever. So you can't sign up. So what can you do with that talent? Well, many of these people would also find themselves in the Home Guard, and the cream of those people when it comes to age and fitness and knowledge of the countryside. So understanding how to live off the land, how to navigate, how to blend in. All of these things are natural to the countryman anyway. So the farmer, the fisherman, the miner, you know, these are all people that are pretty handy, tough, robust individuals. They're not likely to wilt. They're likely to be made of strong stuff. So the cream of that particular Home Guard crop would be plucked. Typically younger elements of that Home Guard, and they'd be taken away for extra paramilitary training and to become auxiliaries. And the auxiliary troops, they were typically taken to places like Coleshill House, and they were given short courses in things like explosives, close combat, different types of firearms, and they were essentially briefed on their task and purpose as stay-behinds. Now, they were organised predominantly in coastal regions, and typically in groups between 4, 6 and 8 individuals. So again, these types of people, and you'd likely know these people. They'd be from the same village as you. It'd be your patch. It'd be your area. It's area that you would have farmed, you would have grown up in. Everybody knows you, which is a good and a bad thing. It means you know the lie of the land, but it also means that if you're seen acting suspiciously, if there are any collaborators, when the enemy take over, you're going to have a bad time. In any case, you know, these are tough, young, predominantly young individuals in occupations that give them many of the skills they need already to be good partisan fighters. Unlike many kind of media representations of what these could have been, it's not like France, where you've got people in typically civilian clothing, carrying out acts of sabotage. The auxiliaries were predominantly a uniformed unit, so they'd be dressed just like any normal Home Guard soldier. And in their kind of what's known as operational bases, so they'd have operational bases underground. Obviously, their job is to be stay-behinds. The Germans have technically gone past them. They've ignored their small, sleepy village, and they've moved on. They've moved up the country. They're rolling up through Birmingham, through Manchester, through Glasgow, what have you. So you've got these stay-behinds in rural locations, often coastal rural locations, and the enemy would have gone past them. And they're staying in operational bases. And those operational bases are relatively deep underground, and they are provisioned with beds, with cooking facilities, with water, with toilet facilities, with ingenious things like chimneys that go up into dead trees to diffuse the smoke. And the job really is to wait for the enemy to pass and then cause merry hell, and to operate independently of the command structure and the logistics of the wider army and the Home Guard. So whilst you are technically Home Guard-esque, and many people would still train with Home Guard units as well as being an auxiliary, in reality you are to be an independent cell. Much like terror cells, your job, the more you know, the more danger you are to everyone else. So you're an independent cell, and you're using your training and your intelligence and your discretion to decide what would be the most harmful thing for the enemy for us to do. Would it be to blow up those planes? Would it be to blow up that bridge? Would it be to assassinate that particular leader? Any number of things might be the most prudent choice for you on your patch. And so those are your OBs, your operational bases. Your group of individuals, your 468 personnel team, they are your OP, the operational patrol. And essentially once you were picked as an auxiliary, you'd undergo training and you'd learn all of the paramilitary skills necessary. And these could often take place over kind of long weekend type scenarios. There's quite a famous example for Coleshill House, where many of these people were trained. They would go to the local post office. They'd be particularly unhappy and unhelpful and stern postmistress. You'd go deliver your secret code, and suddenly you'd find yourself being chauffeured to this paramilitary school where you'd learn all of the great things. Now, of particular interest to people that are into things like the SOE, they're into the Commandos, they're into OSS and other bits and pieces like that. It's interesting to see some of the parallels. One of the first parallels you'll note is that, this is spearheaded by then Major General, now Colonel Sir Colin Gubbins. Now, Colin Gubbins is rather interesting in that he has fought in World War I as an artillery officer, so he's experienced conventional warfare. He's fought partisan warfare as part of a British contingent supporting the White Russians during the Russian Civil War. So again, it's like winter warfare, kind of partisan groups, intelligence gathering, all sorts of stuff like that. He then moves on to fight in Ireland against the IRA. So then he's looking at things more like domestic terrorism. He's understanding the IRA being relatively effective at this time, causing terror, chaos, winning propaganda coups. They're doing lots of rather clever stuff, and Gubbins is not a stupid man. He's learning from his enemy. And then he goes on to fight in Norway with what's known as the independent companies. The independent companies are essentially like a proto-commando unit. They're commandos before the commandos, and they're fighting in Norway, and they're doing aspects of irregular warfare, small unit stuff. So Gubbins is the man with the experience, and he later goes on to spearhead many aspects of the SOE, and prior to that, he's spearheading the auxiliary movement. So at Coleshill House and other places around the country, you would go for your long weekends and you would be trained in a number of things. And these would vary depending on the personnel that are near to you. So unlike the SOE, the OSS, the Commandos that have relatively well laid out programs of education, everyone's learning Fairburn's gutter fighting method, everyone's learning the instinctive combat shooting, blah, 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 blah. You will get many, many regional variances. So some of the things that you'd be trained on when you go to these longer weekends, imagining that you are, say, 18-year-old, young, fit, intelligent farmer, you can't be eligible for service, and you're going away for 4 or 5 days at a time to learn these extra skills in case the Germans invade. Let me just make sure my screensaver does not come on. So what might you learn in these schools? Well, you will learn how to use things such as this. So again, these are from later in the war. So this is a Sten gun. Yep. You would learn how a Sten operates, how it comes apart, how you would dismantle it for clandestine operations. You know, Sten is very notable for its ability to be pulled apart into very small constituent elements. So you would learn firearms such as the Sten, Thompson submachine gun. You would learn semi-automatic pistols. You'd learn how to use revolvers. You might even learn how to use enemy weapons such as a P-38 or a Luger or any number of things. But the firearms are really some of the least important things, because as a stay-behind unit, their job is to be very, very quiet and then suddenly very, very loud. And what I mean by that is if they start shooting, if they start using the boomsticks without much discretion, they're going to find themselves facing superiorly trained Wehrmacht soldiers in greater numbers with greater training, and they're going to get rolled up. Let's be honest. The main usage of an auxiliary is for them to be very, very quiet, very, very sneaky, sneak onto the railway track or the bridge, place the explosives, it goes boom, and they stay alive by doing it again and again and again. Now, the forecasted kind of lifespan of an auxiliary unit would be something like 2 weeks. So, you know, it's not particularly an optimistic forecast of life expectancy. So your job really in that 2 week window is to butcher and bolt, to cause some serious chaos. And often that's better served with explosives than it is with things like submachine guns. Things are interesting to note, you know, they've got lots of varied armaments, but they're getting some of the, what in Britain, especially in the British Armed Forces, would be known as Gucci gear, so good stuff, before many of the units did. So, for example, Thompson submachine guns, which they had in advance of the Stens by a number of years. Thompson submachine guns, they're getting those before many of the commando units or the traditional army units are getting them. So these underground operational patrols and these underground operational bunkers, they're being typically armed with submachine guns, top of the range, expensive submachine guns. The Thompson is an expensive unit. They're being equipped with pistols, often pistols that are coming in from the US. So the New York Police Department donated loads of 38 caliber pistols, so it's surplus to requirements. So with their original black holsters and everything, it's really, really quite cool. It's quite an interesting story to see how different communities volunteered different guns. There are lots of gun clubs in America that donated quantities of all manner of pistols and rifles, many of which found themselves into the hands of the Home Guard and the Auxiliaries. So you've got 38 pistols, you've got Colt 45 automatics, semi-automatics, you've got Thompson submachine guns. Later in the war, you've got Sten submachine guns, you've got your traditional Lee Enfields, and then things like the P-17 and other kind of bolt action and semi-auto rifles and carbines. So there's a big mix of materials. They're pretty well tooled up when it comes to what you'd expect to see of the Commandos or the Home Guard. These guys are getting some of the Gucci gear, some of the premium gear, pistols, submachine guns and rifles. That's quite extensive gear to be given to 18-year-old farmers living in a hole in a farm in Dorset. You know, it's a big leap of faith and trust to go give vital war munitions to those types of people, let alone the new and jazzy types of explosive they would have got their hands on. Plastic explosives, before many of the mainstream areas of the armed forces would ever have had them. So plastic explosive, nitroglycerin, sticky bombs, you know, they're given all these different triggers and fuses, all of these different things to cause absolute carnage. But as I was saying, you know, all of the guns are really a distraction from what these guys really needed to do. And a huge part of Auxiliaries training is split into two key areas. And that's in explosives / munitions. So how to set fuses, how to target structural weak points, how to combine your explosives together to have the greatest effect on tunnels, on bridges, on roads, on railway tracks. So there's that aspect. And then there is close quarter silent methods. So, for example, a lot of auxiliaries would be trained in and equipped with garrots. How to use a garrote and how to take out a sentry with the minimum of fuss, minimum of noise, maximum expediency and efficiency. A lot of them were equipped with clubs and truncheons, many of which of World War One heritage. You're looking at, going a bit medieval here. You're looking at your trench clubs. You're looking at hard wood with metal studs. Top of a Mills bomb, a grenade put onto a big piece of blackthorn. You're looking at how can I use something which is intuitive, relatively concealable, absolutely silent. Why would you run the risk of opening up with a Thompson submachine gun when you can cosh someone over the back of the head with something like this and still manage to put your explosives on that railway line? So, koshes, garrotes, things like the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, when that became popularised, but also a huge array of people's own knives. Remember, a lot of these are countrymen, country folk. They're used to and familiar with carrying knives for normal tasks. So again, as well as the kind of sexier Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife that we all love, just normal knives. And again, people are training how to use these knives, use these cudgels, use all of these things. Another thing that you see very popular in the auxiliary units is quite a strange choice, really. Things like knuckle dusters. People using knuckle dusters are being equipped with knuckle dusters. Can you imagine the balls of absolute steel you would need to walk up to a German sentry, have your knuckle duster on, deck him right in the jaw, and then go blow up a bridge and then leg it? That is work of magnificent testicular fortitude right there. So again, dusters, knives, bats, garrotes, all of these things were part of an auxiliary's training. That's where you'd go to places like Coleshill House to learn how to use them. And it's interesting to see how rich and varied their training was compared to potentially people like the SOE, compared to the Commandos, which are a bit more regimented, a bit more formulaic. You can look at people like Mickey Wood. So Mickey Wood is a lightweight wrestling champion of Great Britain, and he's a sergeant instructor on combat to the Home Guard. And Mickey Wood, so he's got his own manual here. He's talking about places to hit a human being, where to hit them. He talks about nerve strikes, the combat takedowns. You've got hip tosses. You've got edge of hand blows. You've got all the stuff that you might suspect, how to defend against a bayonet, how to defend against hold-up situations, how to defend against strangles. You're getting all this from relatively unknown people like Mickey Wood. And you, depending on where you're based, your training might be from the local hardman. So on a Facebook group which I attend, someone I speak to on there, I think his partner's father was trained as an auxiliary, and they had a boxer from Worcestershire, which is quite cool, because I'm a boxer from Worcestershire, so that's quite cool. But their unarmed combat was taught by a boxer from Worcestershire. You've got other people like Mickey Wood and others that would be titled wrestlers or all-in wrestlers, like catch wrestlers, professional wrestlers, people that wrestle for entertainment, through to judoka, jujitsuka, police officers. Who you get trained by could be very, very, very variable, and the skills they have could be very, very variable. So you've got this hodgepodge of what the local talent is near you, what the local resources are near you. So you're learning unarmed combat, which could be from a boxer, wrestler, police officer, local hard nut. Could be a mixture thereof of those people. What you're being equipped with could be a mixture of kind of police batons, World War II, World War I trench clubs. You might be issued with some degree of official knives, like the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. You would typically be issued with a good brace of pistols and a good brace of submachine guns, and that is a shit hits the fan scenario. So if you're having to use those pistols, those submachine guns, you've done something wrong. A firearm which goes against that, however, is most of the OBs. They had access to a 2.2 rifle, so a kind of a small caliber rifle, scoped, so a low caliber sniping rifle. And that job predominantly was actually to shoot British people, collaborators, conspirators, people that might be able to give up where your operational base is, or who members of your operational patrol could be. So remember, you're only expected to be alive for 2 weeks. You don't want that to be cut short by a week because of the local postman or the local police officer or the local air raid warden. So if you need to do him, you need to do him. You need to do him quickly and at range, and that's where the 2-2 comes in very useful. So most operational patrols were equipped with a small number of submachine guns. Typically every man had his own pistol, or was issued a pistol, and they could be from any provenance, revolver, semi-automatic, and then a mixture of long arms. You'd be given a number of blunt/cold weapons, so knives, bats, cudgels, garrots, knuckle dusters, and you'd be given training and be given the kind of the latest in explosive technology, and then that would be a big focus of your training. So again, it's just interesting to look at the comparisons between how, say, an SOE agent might be trained, and you've got X number of hours in the Fairbairn-Sykes unarmed and knife system, you get X number of hours in the kill house and room clearing, you get X number of hours in, say, lockpicking or radio comms, and you're going through this really rather good pedagogy of spycraft and tradecraft. And you see the same with Commandos, albeit on a slightly more combative level. And then you've got the Auxiliaries, the stay-behinds, that are the elite of the elite home guard, being trained in a variety of different ways on a very, very local level. Only small degree of nationalisation, and that typically is in the kind of sabotage elements. So a good example for this would be Auxiliaries would be given reading material such as this, The Art of Guerrilla Warfare, and it talks about how to stir up a population, how to manage teams of people, so how to be a partisan leader, how to avoid capture, what you can learn from groups such as the IRA when it comes to spreading fear, terror, and so on. You know, there's all this type of stuff. I'm just going to do that screensaver again. Another fascinating area are things such as the stealth guides. So, stealthily made as an advertising catalogue, the Countryman's Diary, and there are a number of these. You know, it starts off looking like an advert for fertiliser, but you open it up and suddenly you see actually it's a number of ways in which you can use explosives and fuses, and plastics, and nobles. You can use different, for example here, where to put the explosives. If you're going to blow up a railway line, don't put it on the outside, put it in between the gauges. It's going to cause a lot more havoc and carnage on that line. And you've got all sorts of things about different timing fuses, different considerations, pressure plates. You know, essentially a terrorist's wet dream, to be quite honest. But you've got all of this material. So you've got trained, independent cells full of young, fit, rural people that have got the access to the latest in firearms technology, comparatively. They've accessed the best explosives. They're being given kind of top-tier training, you know, with people that have got experience with groups like the IRA, like the White Russians, like the Bolsheviks, like the independent companies. So you're getting real value here. And those auxiliary units essentially remained active or ready to be called up all the way up until D-Day, where many of them were stationed on the Isle of Wight and other places. You know, that was essentially their last hurrah. But many people that were an auxiliary member during the early phases of the war, later, as roles changed, as reserved occupations changed, or as they potentially got older, many of them then went on to some rather elite units, such as the SAS, such as the Commandos, such as the SOE. So there's a great cadre, there's a great kind of follow-through of auxiliary alumni that then go on into some of the crack regiments and crack units of World War II. So it's a very interesting aspect of history to look at, in that how their training is very much the same as the units we all know and love, such as the SOE, and also very, very different and very, very variable. Like I mentioned, you could be trained by a boxer, wrestler, police officer, local hardman. You might be given a club, a knife, a Tommy gun, and a couple of revolvers from the New York Police Department, and that's your group. That's you in your operational base, deep underground, with your operational patrol, and you're waiting for the Germans to come. And if they do, you know you've got 2 weeks to cause absolute chaos. So it's a really interesting part. I've got a little Auxiliary badge on. I'll bring this closer to the camera. There you go, little Auxiliary badge. They didn't really get much recognition. They were not really public-facing units, so a lot of the people that did serve in the auxiliaries, they didn't talk about it. After the war, they were sworn to great degrees of secrecy. So it kind of just faded away. It wasn't really ever in the public consciousness anyway. It certainly doesn't have the glamour of things like the Commandos or the SOE, and mainly because they were never actually used. They were ready, they were trained. How well they would have performed, we will never know. And I imagine, like all things, results will vary. You'll have had better and worse operational patrols. But again, at least it was planned in advance. If you look at places where no resistance was planned early doors, it takes a while for people to be trained, equipped, to be connected, to understand how to operate as a cell, a safe operational cell that doesn't compromise the whole, but still work to the aims and ambitions of the whole. There's all these things that many other organisations across Europe had to figure their way through, whereas Britain was ahead of the curve in being on top of this just in case it would happen. So the auxiliary units, really, really fascinating to look at. There's some great accounts available. There's some great interviews. There's a small but dedicated community out there interviewing people, talking to them about their ammunition, their munitions, their training, the different kind of makeup of individuals. You've got former farmers with poachers that would have been poaching off their land, and suddenly they're part of one operational base. Again, all sorts of interesting stories out there, and there are a number of these underground bunkers that you can still go to and find today. And they've not all been found. They're being found all the time. In fact, I was on a survival weekend a couple of weeks ago, and there's one right there. There's one right there on private land, and no one knew really what it was about or how it worked over in Dorset. So it's a fantastic little nugget of history. It's fantastic to learn about how they were trained. You can see from things like the Countryman's Journal just how in depth some of their training went into. So they're a big investment really at a time of great national shortage and crisis. So it's very interesting to see and think about how they would have performed, how they were trained, and what we can learn from that if we are reconstructing or thinking about World War II combatives, World War II irregular warfare. They're a great study outside of the typical content we consume. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about the auxiliary units. Hopefully that's inspired you to go have a mooch and research yourself. I'm not a historian, I'm a fighter. So again, any errors are absolutely my own. Go out there, have a look, but it's a fantastically rich and worthwhile field to get under your skin. Have a little play, have a little read, and enjoy some of the content learning about the auxiliaries. Cheers.